Known yesterday, when I left the radio, I had begun dealing with the matter of rightly dividing the word of truth. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 15, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness. In this matter of rightly dividing the word of truth, it is only the matter of rightly dividing that enables the Bible student to take a King James Bible literally and at face value and never have the text of the King James Bible contradict. You must rightly divide a King James Bible. It's my opinion that the King James text is a perfect document. Personally, I believe that the King James text is supernatural and is inspired. There's no doubt in my mind, and I have read in the modern translations. In fact, there was a time in my ministry, now many, many years ago, but a time in my ministry when I truly thought that the New Berkeley version was the most accurate translation. I'm long beyond that now. I no longer believe that. But there was a time in my life and in my ministry when I felt like the New Berkeley version was the most accurate, and I freely and openly, as many fundamentalists do, I freely and openly corrected the text of the King James Bible. I no longer do that anymore. Now, I left the program yesterday asking a question. I'd like to try to deal with this today as the Lord shall help me. But how do I know that a man is rightly dividing the word of truth? I hear men all along and they say, I'm going to rightly divide this passage. And whenever they finish, they finish their message, I'm not sure that anyone had any idea what they were trying to do. I was just as confused about the passage when they closed their message as I was when they began. So on Sunday morning, I go off down to the Presbyterian church and I sit down in the congregation and I listen to the Calvinist evangelical. And you know that no true Calvinist is a fundamentalist, in my estimation. They would embrace Reformed theology, and of course, embracing Reformed theology, the tenets of replacement theology, that the church now replaces Israel in covenant and in promises, and all the promises and covenants made to the nation of Israel are now to be appropriated to the New Testament church. Also, a man that is truly Calvinistic must, of necessity, because he embraces replacement theology, must of necessity be amillennial and embrace amillennialism. So I go off down to hear the Calvinist evangelical preach to his people on Sunday morning. And he stands before his people and he appropriates the future kingdom passages of Isaiah and Jeremiah to the glory of the gospel era. And all of the literal promises made by the prophet Isaiah and all the literal promises made by the prophet Jeremiah, he now is allegorizing those passages and appropriating them entirely to apply to the church. And then he would go further in his sermon to deal with the predestination and election and appropriating predestination to the unregenerated. Paul states that God has predestinated us, not them. Predestinating us, born-again believers, not them, lost sinners. But he would appropriate the matter of predestination to the unregenerated, and would say that at conception, in the mother's womb, some are predestinated to heaven, others are predestinated to hell, and he would deal with the matter of fatalism. When the sermon is over, I'd get up from my pew and shake his hand at the front door, and I would question him on his appropriation of Scripture and his interpretation of Scripture. And he would caustically say to me, "Now, sir, I'll have you to understand that I earned my bachelor's degree at Westminster University, and I earned my master's degree and my doctorate from John Calvin College, and I would have you to understand that I am rightly dividing these passages of Scripture. And I'll not hear your criticism of my homily this morning, but I would have you to understand that I, because of my education, that I'm qualified to rightly divide the word of truth." Well, the following Sunday, I'd get my Bible under my arm, and I'd go down the road to the local Arminian Pentecostal church. And I'd sit down with the congregation there, and the pastor would go to the pulpit, and he would deal with Matthew 24:13. "But he that shall endure unto the end shall be saved." And for the next hour, the local Pentecostal pastor would preach salvation by holding on and holding out and holding out faithful and finding the Lord and praying through and agonizing with God and weeping my way to God. He would talk about finding the Lord, and then he'd talk about losing the Lord, and he'd preach about finding the Lord again. Positively, a summary of his sermon, as I sit there with my Bible open and listen to him preach, would be the unassurance of salvation by the works of righteousness on the believer's part and striving to enter in. And after about an hour, he'd wind the sermon down and appeal for men to come to the altar to be saved again, and would appeal for men to come and make sure that they're bound for the promised land. And on my way out the front door, I'd shake hands with him, and I'd question him concerning his theology and his rightly dividing the word of truth and using Matthew 24:13 as a salvation text, when the entire context of Matthew 24 and 25 is the nation of Israel, the Jews, in the tribulation period. And this minister would caustically answer back and state, "Now, I'll have you to know that I earned my bachelor's degree in Cleveland, Tennessee at the Church of God College, and I will have you to know that I am rightly dividing the word of truth." Now, I'm faced with a dilemma here, as is every other Bible student faced with a dilemma. It is obvious that the Calvinists that I heard preach the Sunday previous, the Calvinist evangelical, preaching predestination and appropriating to the church Israel's covenants and promises and denying the millennial kingdom. And then the Pentecostal preacher the following Sunday preaching the exact opposite, that I need to find the Lord, but then I might lose the Lord, so I need to find the Lord again. And I need to be very careful that I don't lose the Lord again. Now, it's obvious that both of these men are not, they cannot be, rightly dividing the word of truth. There's no way that both of them can be rightly dividing the word of truth when they are preaching a theology that is 180 degrees out of phase with each other. The predestinationist Calvinist on the one hand, and then the charismatic Arminian on the other hand. Common logic would indicate that one or the other of them must be wrong. One or the other of them, both of them cannot be right and be 180 degrees apart. They both can't be right. You can't say, now the weather's hot outside and the weather's freezing cold outside on the same day. Somebody's going to be wrong. Someone is going to be wrong. Now, common logic says that if words are to mean things, if words have any meaning, and if theology has any meaning, if there is any knowledge to be acquired in the matter of study, both of these men are not right. So the poor listener sitting there on the pew, and he hears a conflicting and a contradictory theology preached and both men, while contradicting each other, caustically, whenever they're questioned on the matter, both of them caustically state, but wait a minute, I am rightly dividing this passage. I am rightly dividing the word of truth. And yet both of their messages are 180 degrees out of phase. It's apparent to me that they're both not rightly dividing the word of truth. One of them is theologically wrong. Now my time is getting away from me and I have just only a few moments. It is my position as a dispensationalist that both of these men are wrong. But for the sake of argument, the Calvinist over here on one hand, the Arminian over here on the other hand, it is obvious to me that both of them cannot be right, yet both of them claim to be rightly dividing the word of truth. One of them is wrongly dividing it. And it doesn't matter how long or how loudly he says, but I am rightly dividing the word of truth. One of these men is wrongly dividing the word of truth. Now my time has gotten away from me and I'm going to have to pick up with this, the Lord willing, on Monday on the August 10 broadcast. But I want to begin trying to develop an understanding of what Paul means in 2 Timothy 2:15 when he says, uses the phrase, rightly dividing the word of truth.
Write the Bright Spot Hour at Post Office Box 4, Greenville, South Carolina 29602. Visit the website at